ways representative of the times that we live in. They're obviously meant to be very political, polemical, even, I would say, in tone. I think the intent is to create a powerful feeling and communicate something to us about the age that we're in. They are not intended to make us feel comfortable, and I think that's exactly their purpose, their usefulness for us here as we try together to grasp what our historical circumstance is and how it is that we as Christians should respond to it. I think in the least what we're seeing here, without saying a whole lot more, is that the historical moment that most of us have lived our lives in is and has been shifting, and that we need to try to grasp what's happening to the deepest constructs that we've become very accustomed to believing will just last. At least I'm speaking for those of us perhaps in North America and perhaps Europe, but that the very structures of our political lives have been deeply affected in the last years that we've been living. So we're going to watch the videos, and then after that, we'll have some follow-up commentary and introductions from Alexandre. Okay, to the videos.
Okay.
Ipirangas, margens plácidas de povo heróico, um brado retumbante. E o sol da liberdade em raios fúlgidos brilhou no céu da pátria nesse instante. Se o penhor dessa igualdade conseguimos conquistar com braço forte, em teu seio, ó liberdade, desafio nosso peito à própria morte. Ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve, Brasil, um sonho intenso, um raio vívido de amor e de esperança a terra desce. Se em teu formoso céu risonho e límpido a imagem do cruzeiro resplandece, gigante pela própria natureza, és bela, és forte, impávido colosso. Se o teu futuro espelha essa grandeza, terra dourada, entre outras mil és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada. Dos filhos desse sol és mãe gentil, pátria amada, Brasil.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that a flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave, the brave. Thank you guys so much. Any questions?
Bom, o Eric falou que ia voltar a comentar alguma coisa. Ou... Falou. Está desligado ali.
I thought I said that you were making the comments after the video, comrade.
Tá bom. Não, tudo bem.
No. The first time I saw this, I was sort of stunned. And as I've thought about it more, the way I've been thinking about this, for one, it's a sociological phenomenon that we have to try to grapple with and try to understand what's happening, and what these kinds of videos represent. But I think that we need to hear the national anthems being sung in something like a dirge, a moment of lament when you see these images with it. And I think what they're telling us is that the rise of these nationalist leaders is signaling actually the decline of the nation state. And this is, I think, the kind of political crisis that we're facing. Political crises are nothing new, of course, and historians of all people expect them. But we still need to think together as citizens and as Christians how it is that we should respond to them. So with that in view, we have an excellent session ahead of us today. And now I will turn it over to Alexandre Brasil to introduce our speakers and add whatever wisdom he would like.
Muito obrigado, Eric. Boa tarde novamente para cada uma. Vamos ouvir os convidados, acho que é o melhor caminho que a gente tem. A ideia hoje à tarde, então, é ter uma conversa, com certeza, bastante produtiva sobre a religião evangélica e a política em termos de pandemia. E, basicamente, há muito a associação e a proximidade que os governos nacionais possuem com o segmento evangélico, sendo uma base de sustentação bem importante, tanto do governo Trump como do governo Bolsonaro. Nessa sessão de hoje à tarde, eu tenho o privilégio de estar com 3 pessoas que eu admiro profundamente, 2 que eu conheço há algum tempo, Ronilso há bastante tempo, quando era um menino, será que é mais velho do que eu? Não é da minha idade, Ronilso, mas conheço o Ronilso há muito tempo, uma pessoa extremamente especial, inteligentíssima, e pai da Olivia, a coisa mais importante que ele tem na vida é isso. A Heidi, que é mãe do Martin, e também é uma pessoa sensacional, que eu tive o privilégio de conhecê-la em 2013, mas a fama chegou muito antes, né? E conheci de poder rever em 2013, mas é uma pessoa extremamente importante para a Igreja Evangélica e o cristianismo no mundo, a professora Heidi. E uma pessoa que eu conheci aqui no seminário, quem me apresentou o livro foi o professor Joel, do Calvin University, que é a professora do MEI, que tem um livro que é extremamente interessante, vocês vão conhecê-la em breve, e eu fiquei mais uma pessoa que eu admiro, que eu tenho a oportunidade de mediar, então, a conversa entre o Ronilso, Kristin e Heidi. Enfim, passar logo a palavra para o Ronilso. O Ronilso é formado em teologia pela Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, a PUC-Rio, é pastor de uma comunidade batista na cidade que ele cresceu, que é São Gonçalo, Grande Rio, ativista, escritor, atualmente residindo em Nova York, onde ele faz o mestrado no Union Theological Seminary, que, salvo engano, é o mesmo local que a Heidi fez o mestrado dela, não? Acho que sim. Que é ligado à Universidade de Colômbia. Ele é autor do livro Teologia Negra, o sopro antirracista do espírito, e é fellow da Ford Foundation Global Fellowship. Queria agradecer ao Ronilso aí o seu tempo e disponibilidade e pedir, então, que ele exponha suas ideias e propostas em relação a esta sessão. Obrigado, Ronilso. 25 minutos.
Ok, eu que agradeço. Todo mundo está me ouvindo bem? Todo mundo ouvindo? Ok.
Sim.
Ok. Então, obrigado, Alexandre. Obrigado pelo convite, por essa oportunidade incrível. Quero só ressaltar que eu continuo.
And I would just like to state that I'm still a boy, at least I think I am, and I believe this will be a great conversation, an interesting conversation, and I hope that my contribution will be on the same level of the colleagues that are presenting. I am going to read what I thought about sharing with you this afternoon, and I'm going to start reading my text. So my topic is the relationship between Brazil and the United States and the narrative of religious persecution and destruction of the family amid the pandemic. In the United States, Christian nationalism and white evangelical supporters of Donald Trump are ready to sabotage an apparent shift on the horizon, which, following anti-racist protests in the wake of the assassination of George Floyd and the disastrous performance of the Trump administration regarding COVID-19, seems to make it possible to frustrate the president's re-election plans. Authors Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, in their book, Taking America Back for God, define Christian nationalism as a framework that guides Americans' perspective on national identity, belonging, and social hierarchies. In Brazil, theologian and historian Fábio Pi used the category of Christ fascism, Christofascism, to identify this group that, by joining the government or giving it unconditional support, strengthens its use of religion and the theology of power as a shield for its authoritarian character. He is using Dorothy Zoll's term. She's a German theologian that used this term to talk about the religious support to the Nazi party. Verses like, you will know the truth and the truth shall set you free, taken from the Gospel of John, expressions like Brazil above all, God above everyone, and the frequent reaffirmation that Brazil is a country of Christian majority has been the language of the imposition of an increasingly conservative and strongly evangelical Christian sovereignty. Brazil and the United States are united to other countries like Hungary and Poland as leaders in an alliance that aims to fight for religious freedom in the world. In theory, the International Alliance for Religious Freedom focuses on the freedom of all religions. But in practice, however, a Twitter by Ernesto Araújo, the Minister of Foreign Affairs here in Brazil, said on Twitter this, quote, "Together with Hungary and other nations, Brazil is putting the fight against persecution of Christians on the international agenda. The devaluation of Christianity by the politically correct culture in the Christian majority countries themselves is a big part of the problem," end quote. On February 5th, in September last year, Ernesto Araújo used this tweet, and he has this key place in the equation due to the networks that Brazilian diplomacy can build and contribute to a project that unifies the fundamentalist Christian right with a political supremacy project. It is not by chance that Araújo failed to state in an interview with the Financial Times in June 2019 that Christian values must be back at the center of worldview. And he says that this implementation of a Christian worldview as structural and the fight against religious persecution of Christians is a fundamental part of an international conservative diplomatic alliance. And we see that this would be something that doesn't happen by chance, right? Because it is no accident that in the first weeks of the coronavirus's arrival in Brazil, the ministers strove to make the public association between the virus, China, and communism. This is what he said on Twitter, quote, "Given this, we need to fight for the health of the body and the health of the human spirit against coronavirus, but also against communivirus, which tries to take advantage of the destructive opportunity opened by the first, a parasite of the parasite," end quote. To associate the virus and the spread of the virus with China and consequently with communism is not a random association. Communism has long been evoked as an incarnation of evil and a denial of Christianity and in consequence of Christian values. By extension, communism is also against the family, the nuclear family, the traditional family. Therefore, the evoking the concept of communivirus is not just a debauchery and a disregard for the seriousness of the pandemic, but part of a persistent narrative that Christian values and the family are threatened by its usual enemies. In this sense, these usual enemies would not be happy in just destroying family, but now they want to destroy the whole of humanity, and they created a virus to do that. In this sense, the pandemic does not appear to have entered the government as a de facto pandemic or as something that highlights the country's profound inequalities and above all exposes the vulnerability of the poorest and most precarious. The fundamentalist evangelical religious nucleus of the government and its supporters maintained the understanding of the pandemic as a moral, political, and cultural enemy, directly linked to all progressive, left, and/or libertarian expressions. And we even include a conspiracy against science and their communist scientists. In August this year, Minister Damares said that the country would need to be rebuilt after the pandemic. But as in all of her monothematic speeches, Damares fails to recognize and deal with the evils caused by a pandemic that has already taken more than 100,000 Brazilian lives. The pandemic, in her speech, remains yet another pretext for her pro-family crusade. It is not by chance, when giving examples, Damares mentions, for example, the number of divorces that, according to her, took place after the pandemic. At the now famous ministerial meeting in April, at the opportunity she had to speak as the only woman in a meeting composed only of ministers who are men, Damares made a point of framing the then arrived Health Minister Nelson Teich to draw his attention to the fact that the Ministry of Health was, quote, full of feminists who have a unique agenda, which is the legalization of abortion, end quote, and completed by saying that this minister should know that this government is a pro-family government. Therefore, the family remains the great narrative resource, the main shield of the actions and pretensions of a ministry that bears human rights in its title, but that does not seem to assume for itself the concerns due to the loss of minimum rights and dignity that have been caused by the pandemic in Brazilian territory. Emphasizing the defense of the family has become one of the forms taken by the discourse of religious persecution and Christian supremacy in times of the pandemic in Brazil and the United States. It is present in the speeches of the Damares as much as in the speeches of mass resistance. This active, ultra-conservative, and pro-Trump, anti-gay organization, which started a fight with the governor of Massachusetts due to the mandatory use of masks. Mass Resistance wrote on its page saying, quote, in the historic Boston Common, where patriots and revolutionaries used to walk, people now wear masks in obedience to the governor's orders, end quote. And then wrote that the governor did not have this right by law, and the mandatory use of the mask as well as social isolation were unconstitutional measures. And now I'm going to talk about the different sources of this conspiracy. I just heard about a church in São Gonçalo, my town, in Rio de Janeiro, in which the preacher went to the service without a mask. One of the pastors was not wearing a mask because he received a revelation about this, and in his preaching, he was associating the mandatory use of masks like a barcode, which would represent the number of the beast. So that would be given to those who have abandoned their faith and that then would not be saved. So now going back to the narrative of religious persecution, I believe this is particularly concerning in relation to Brazil, where the religions that suffer the most violence are the religions of African origin, such as Candomblé. Between 2015 and the first half of 2019, 2,722 cases of violence against temples of these religions were recorded in Brazil. And in 2019, there was an increase of 56% in the number of these attacks. And this also raises a great racial debate, since religions such as Candomblé and Umbanda are practiced mainly by the Black population. In Brazil, January 21st is the National Day to fight religious intolerance, precisely because of the memory of Yalorixá Gildásia dos Santos, known as Mãe Gilda de Ogum. In 2000, Mother Gilda de Ogum had a heart attack when she learned of the violence suffered in her temple by members of the Universal Church, and she did not endure the attacks and offenses against her temple, in addition to seeing her husband being beaten. The Universal Church belongs to Bishop Edir Macedo, one of the richest and most influential religions in Brazil. It is also worth considering the place occupied by the greatest vulnerability already statistically proven of the Black population in Brazil to the new coronavirus and what the government has done and said about it. The discourse of religious intolerance and religious racism that permeates government policies and the narrative in defense of Christian supremacy affects the Black population in Brazil, also in the form of neglect and differentiated care in the midst of the pandemic. In the Christian, white, and traditional nuclear family scope of Brazilian fundamentalism today in the government, there are not the realities of the communities of Blacks and Blacks living in the Brazilian peripheries, as well as the care for indigenous populations, which Minister Damares tried including raising the deceptive, unfounded arguments about the purposeful contamination of tribes and villages designed to, according to her, to incriminate the Bolsonaro government, as if someone would have to create reasons for people to incriminate the Bolsonaro government. Nevertheless, Damares was never able to prove this statement and never brought it up again. In the United States, since April, there has been a wide repercussion of the largest number of deaths in the Black community by the coronavirus. In some states, the difference between Blacks and whites killed by the pandemic was almost double. And in Chicago, it was 62% Black for 32% among whites. In South Carolina, 56% for 27%, and in Michigan, it was 40% Blacks and 14% whites. And in this sense, the work of many of the so-called Black churches was key. They were extremely important in positioning themselves, dealing with the severity of the situation and overcoming the abandonment that the Black community had of the Trump administration, just as Black Brazilian community had for the Bolsonaro government. So churches like Salem Baptist Church and Abyssinian Black Baptist Church were instrumental. In Tennessee, Meharry Medical College has partnered with several Black churches to provide testing and assistance to the Black population. In Brazil, many churches on the outskirts of cities in Rio de Janeiro and Recife, and of course, in other places like Bahia, in the city of Salvador, these were equally important to assist the needs and urgencies of the local community and to overcome the social weaknesses due to the long period of interrupted work and resource limits with the help of only 600 reais given by the government. The key here is to observe how the family protection discourse fails to look at the deep inequalities exposed by the pandemic. Thus, it is evident that the pro-family discourse serves nothing more than an instrument to lure the adhesion of ultra-conservative identity whose main objective is to maintain control and power, deciding on politics, morals, and rights. It is not by chance that at the moment when Brazil reached the sad mark of 100,000 dead, no manifestation of solidarity, mourning, or regret was seen from the evangelical leaders who were with Bolsonaro, both in the call for the so-called fast for Brazil in March or the Easter celebration in April. If in March the motive for calling this fast was so that God could act in the Brazilian nation, and in particular to give the country's the condition it needed to face the pandemic, now in August, however, we only see a cold reaction, and some pages in the first 24 hours after the news that we reached the 100,000 dead said absolutely nothing. The posts and comments followed naturally, updated only messages about Father's Day, which would happen the next day. And when I went to go after these posts, when we reached the 100,000 dead, trying to map out the news related to condolences, it was interesting because Silas Malafaia talked about many different videos on gender theology, male and female, all the left-wing conspiracies to change people's sexual orientation. And weeks after calling the fast, the pastor and Congressman Marco Feliciano even posted about a possible reduction in the number of coronavirus contamination, which he brought about as a result of the fast. And this was widely shared and commented on his Twitter feed by other conservative evangelicals. So in fact, families, at least all families, was never their goal. Now, reaching my conclusions, Bolsonaro's stance, as well as his past, which involves his long relationship with a group of militiamen in Rio de Janeiro, have always been widely known. His racist, xenophobic, homophobic, and sexist statements are also known. Therefore, each vote of the evangelical leaders around him and who offered their explicit support to him was a vote fully aware of the risks, responsibility, and who would be those who would lose and be deeply affected by his election and administration. And this unites Bolsonaro and Trump regarding the support received by both, be it white evangelical and Christian nationalism, be it Brazilian evangelical fundamentalism. During the 2016 election race, the United States learned of the revelation of a recording of Donald Trump's conversation in 2005, in which he talks horrible things about sexual violence. What was published and heard seemed to be able to overthrow anyone who presented themselves as a candidate to defend Christian values. However, the episode was treated with quiet complicity by most conservative leaders, which allowed it to be defended by people like Jerry Falwell. And the relativization made by Falwell could not be more dishonest. He said, there really is only one difference between the two. Mr. Trump promises to support religious freedom and the dignity of unborn children. Mrs. Hillary Clinton promises to do the opposite. Likewise, all of Jair Bolsonaro's indefensible statements and behaviors become defensible for evangelical fundamentalists, which brought together in a debate on one of the country's most popular evangelical radio stations, used its leadership positions to intimidate voters in voting for Bolsonaro in the second round of the 2018 elections. And I would like to quote Pastor Silas Malafaia, quote, "Do you have the mind of Christ and will vote for a person who plays the games of Satan?" End quote. Another important pastor, Humberto Siqueira, says this: "I have a candidate who defends everything that is harmful to the family and to moral principles." And he was referring to Bolsonaro. On the other hand, I have a candidate who is, quote, "I have a candidate who defends everything that is harmful to the family and to moral principles. On the other hand, I have a candidate who is against the gender ideology, against abortion, against the legalization of marijuana," end quote. And he was referring to Bolsonaro as the latter. You know, nor did it appear that the candidate defender of the family, Bolsonaro, pushed a congressman in parliament in 2003. Also, they never mentioned the fact that he said on statement that he would not rape a given congresswoman because she was very ugly in 2014. And it also forgot to mention that he mocked Blacks from former slave communities, and also the fact that he said that he would beat up his son if his son was gay. As for Trump, it also seems to be true for Bolsonaro that fundamentalist evangelicals do not look to him and do not want him to be an ideal type of Christian. What they end up doing is actually that they are willing to order and do the dirty work that they need to be done. So now it is expected with great expectation on the part of all people who cherish radical equality, justice, democracy, inclusion, and diversity, and want to end structural racism, that Donald Trump is not reelected. But until then, Christian nationalism is doing everything possible to recover its lost world and its sovereignty, threatened in the face of social tensions and strong protests. Furthermore, the pandemic, which seemed to contribute to exposing the contradictions and weaknesses of the Trump administration, seems to be losing this strength, as a segment loyal to Trump is resisting and assuming the discourse of using the pandemic to prevent Trump from succeeding in making America great again. Likewise, the challenge in Brazil serves perhaps even greater. More recent polls show that Bolsonaro's popularity increases while rejection decreases. And the pandemic seems to be reorganizing the social tension board. This denial, including the denial of evangelicals, seems to have some effect, perceiving in the face of Bolsonaro's indifference to the 100,000 dead. Those who have denied and continue to deny it, including the real benefits of social distancing, imagine that everything that could be done was done, and that God was and remains in control of everything. And we continue to struggle with the gods. That's it.
Muito obrigado, Ronilso.
Thank you very much, Ronilso.
Passo então a palavra, sem mais delongas.
So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Professor Kristin May. She's a history professor
Ela é autora
at Calvin University. She's the author of 2 books, one about Catherine Bushnell, who is an American doctor who translated the Bible in the beginning of the century, the 20th century, a new gospel for women, and she's the author of another book that was launched this year, and free translation would be Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Extremely interesting, this book by Professor Dumay. So I would like to thank her for her presence and participation at this webinar, and I turn over to you.
Thank you. And this is all coming through clearly? Okay, great. So thank you, Alexandre and Eric and the Nagel Institute. It's really an honor to be here with you today and share with you a little bit of my research. So this paper is drawn from the research in my book, Jesus and John Wayne. When I finished the manuscript a year ago, almost exactly, I had no idea it would be releasing into a global pandemic just a few weeks ago. And so this paper is an attempt to take that research and consider our current moment. So in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, Florida pastor Rodney Howard Brown was arrested when he refused to close the doors of his megachurch. Weeks later, evangelical pastors in California spearheaded resistance to Governor Gavin Newsom's stay-at-home measures. Here in West Michigan, too, evangelical pastors are urging members to refuse to comply with government recommendations. This isn't just a top-down phenomenon. The evangelical rank and file, too, have pushed back in many cases against public health measures. Not only did evangelical churches close less frequently than mainline churches in states that mandated closures, but surveys suggest that even when individual churches did close, some members nevertheless chose to worship in churches that remained open. In many cases, members themselves have pressured church leaders to keep their doors open. Evangelicals' cavalier attitude can be attributed in part to the fact that many do not believe that the threat is as dire as they've been told. According to a Pew survey conducted in April, nearly 70% of white evangelicals believe that the news media has exaggerated the risks of COVID-19. Nearly 40% believe public health officials have done so as well. A more general mistrust of scientific expertise, along with a documented penchant for believing and promoting conspiracy theories, no doubt contributes to this skepticism. Moreover, white evangelicals' devotion to President Trump plays a role as well. For months, Trump has downplayed the threat of the virus and undermined public health efforts, including social distancing, mask wearing, and stay-at-home and lockdown measures. But if you ask evangelicals themselves, many will insist that they are simply choosing faith over fear. One of President Trump's evangelical faith advisors, the Reverend Jentizen Franklin of Gainesville, Georgia, made this case in an online sermon on March 15, the day christened by Trump as the National Day of Prayer against the coronavirus. Trump himself tuned in online to hear Franklin expound on Psalm 91. Fear not is mentioned 366 times in the Bible, Franklin proclaimed. That's a fear not for every day you get up, turn on the TV, or somebody sneezes at work or coughs. Urging listeners to choose faith over fear, over
Com licença, Christian. Sorry. Juliana, o seu áudio está picotando.
Excuse me, Chris. Juliana's audio is cutting off. Ok, eu vou tentar. A minha internet está boa, eu posso tentar.
Não, já melhorou essa tua última fala aqui agora. Não, ele tá picotando, mas você falou, melhorou. Só era talvez o fone, só. Sim, tenta falar mais, era que estava picotando com o tempo. Parece ok. Ok. Sim. Ok. Chris, sorry.
Are we good to go? Okay. Okay, so we were faith over fear. So Franklin dismissed the concerns about the virus, and many other leaders echoed these sentiments, including Jerry Falwell Jr. What's puzzling about this brazen language of faith over fear is that it appears to contradict much of evangelical social and political behavior. Consider, for example, evangelical attitudes towards guns. Rather than boasting faith over fear, evangelicals see firearms as necessary for the protection of their loved ones. White evangelicals are more likely than other Americans to own a gun. And if they do...
Sorry again. Voltou a falar, Juliana. Sorry.
Talvez eu possa ajudar.
Ou talvez botar a Denise agora, não sei. E parece que está partido o fio. Talvez quebrou. Está falhando. E a impressão que me dá é elétrico. Fio quebrado.
Just Kristin, this is Eric.
Não, mas Juliana, é fio partido, assim, o som é bem peculiar. Tá? O fio do fone, ou mau contato no plug, mas não é nada físico, né? É um problema físico. Tá? Ok, então passa para Denise. Christian, sorry, and come back.
Okay. Is there anything I can do different, or is the problem somewhere else, or?
No, it's only the problem. It's a technical problem. It's okay now. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so evangelicals like to carry guns, more likely to own a gun, to carry it with them, and to believe that Americans should be able to carry guns wherever they want. Far from fearless, white evangelicals are also more likely than other Americans to fear Muslims, to support the construction of a border wall to protect the nation against undocumented immigrants, and to engage in preemptive war and condone the use of torture in order to defend the nation from potential threats. Indeed, fear appears to have motivated much of the last half-century of evangelical politics. When evangelicals mobilized as a partisan political movement in the 1960s and 1970s, they united around a fear of communism, feminism, secular humanism, and for many, a fear of losing their white privilege. Once the specter of communism had been vanquished, evangelical fears were channeled into the culture wars. In 2001, a new threat appeared beyond the nation's shores, and the terror attacks of September 11 heightened fear of Muslims. The presidency of Barack Obama only exacerbated evangelical fears of encroaching liberalism, demographic decline, the future of the Supreme Court, and the erosion of their religious liberty. It was this fear, so the thinking went, that drove white evangelicals into the arms of Donald Trump, a strong man who offered evangelicals his protection. Some of this might be a little familiar if you listened to John Fia yesterday. Now, however, in the midst of a global pandemic, conservative white evangelicals claim to be fearless in the face of COVID-19. What explains this change of heart? Perhaps it is our narrative of evangelical fear that requires revision. The nature of evangelical fear comes into clearer focus when we apply the lens of gender. For the past 75 years, gender has played a critical role in the formation of evangelical identity. During the 1960s and 70s, as white evangelicals coalesced as a cultural and political movement, gender difference was at the heart of their identity. For evangelicals, gender difference entailed a masculine ideal that prioritized provision and protection. Men were to provide for their families and to protect them from all sources of harm. Women, meanwhile, were considered weak, vulnerable, and in need of protection. James Dobson was one of the key proponents of gender difference. Males and females, he wrote, differ biochemically, anatomically, and emotionally. They are unique in every cell of their bodies. For Dobson, the differences were easily apparent. Men liked sports and hunting and hiking in the wilderness, while women yawned from the sidelines and waited at home. But the most profound difference between men and women, according to Dobson, was their source of self-esteem. Men derive self-esteem by being respected. Women feel worthy when they are loved. According to Dobson, these differences reflected God-ordained gender roles, the time-honored relationship of husband as loving protector and wife as recipient of that protection. Now, although evangelicals like Dobson claimed that these gender roles were divinely instituted, this emphasis on stark gender difference and on the masculine role of protection was in response to shifting historical circumstances. During the Cold War, with the fate of Christian America at stake, evangelicals rallied to defend God and country. And this required an aggressive military response and an aggressively militant faith. To accomplish both, evangelicals championed the trope of masculine protector. The ideal Christian man needed to be tough enough to do what needed to be done, resorting to violence when necessary. The ends would justify the means. The Vietnam War, however, revealed a crisis of American masculinity. The fact that American soldiers were unable to subdue a ragtag enemy in the jungles of Vietnam was a cause for alarm for evangelicals. Fundamentalist megachurch pastor Jack Hyles spelled this out in his 1972 book, How to Rear Children. Offering advice on how to make a man out of a boy, Hyles insisted that boys needed to be taught to be winners. This is how we get our General MacArthurs. If you teach boys how to be good losers, you'll end up with a generation of young men unwilling to fight for their country, willing to let the strongest nation on earth bow down in shame before a little late nation like North Vietnam. It was up to Christian parents to raise a generation of men who would fight for their country. To do this, parents should make boys play with boys and with guns, cars, baseballs, basketballs, and footballs. Failing to do so might lead their boys to become homosexuals. A boy needed to be taught to fight, to be rugged enough to defend his home and those he loved. Hyles bought his own son a pair of boxing gloves when he was 5 and a .22 at 15. When a neighbor boy insulted his daughter, he encouraged his son to beat him bloody. Such violence was sanctified. God pity this weak-kneed generation which stands for nothing, fights for nothing, and dies for nothing. For men like Hyles, masculinity and militarism were intimately connected. Dobson too asserted the importance of distinct gender roles for both home and nation. We must not abandon the biblical concept of masculinity and femininity at this delicate stage of our national history, he implored. He blamed feminists for tampering with the time-honored roles of protector and protected, and by denigrating masculine leadership as macho, leaving men in confusion and the nation in peril. The rise of family values politics also occurred against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. Although some evangelicals offered cautious support for civil rights legislation, many Southern evangelicals in particular remained staunchly opposed. In the wake of Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court ruling mandating the desegregation of schools, many Southerners turned to private Christian academies to maintain segregation. When the tax-exempt status of these segregation academies was revoked in 1970, evangelicals defended their right to segregated schools by arguing for the authority of parents to make decisions about their children's education, free from governmental overreach. Later opposition to forced busing employed similar rhetoric. Implicit in this rhetoric was the role of white parents, primarily that of the white patriarch, in protecting their children from imagined threats, even as other children and families faced very real dangers. The intersection of race with evangelical family values is apparent as well in evangelical opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, in the 1970s. This was the first issue that conservatives mobilized around after they lost the battle for segregation. And the very language that activists used reflected these affinities. They spoke of forced busing and of forced women, and they coined the term desexegration. Racial anxieties also surfaced in connection to the potty issue. With schools and public facilities recently integrated, the ERA then threatened to turn public restrooms into unisex spaces. One North Carolina state legislator expressed the nature of this threat plainly, quote, "I ain't going to have my wife be in the bathroom with some big black buck," end quote. This blending of white supremacy and the perceived sexual vulnerability of white women had a long history in the South. Here too, however, it is important to recognize that historical evidence irrefutably demonstrates that it was Black women who had reason to fear white men's sexual aggression and not the other way around. White men had long positioned themselves as protectors of white womanhood, a tradition that cultivated male bravado and that could easily spill over into racial aggression. It's worth noting that white evangelical emphasis on male protectors became entrenched at a moment when racial anxieties provided this important subtext. In various ways then, perceived threats bolstered masculine authority, and that was then asserted in defense of Christian America, in the service of white supremacy, and also within evangelical homes. As these contexts demonstrate, however, the relationship between evangelical fear and militancy is a tangled one. Although evangelical rhetoric depicted militancy as a response to pre-existing fears, in fact, militancy has often been employed in order to maintain white evangelical power, and that militancy required the continual stoking of fear. Examining these dynamics in local church settings can help tease out this relationship between evangelical masculinity, militancy, and fear. Jerry Falwell's Thomas Road Baptist offers an illuminating case study. This is Jerry Falwell Sr. He started his own fundamentalist Baptist church in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1956. And in 1967, the same year Virginia mandated the desegregation of public schools, he founded a private Christian academy. In 1979, he founded the Moral Majority to advance the religious right. 2 years later, a journalist published a profile on Falwell and his church that reveals the contours of an evangelical politics of fear. The church was, quote, an army equipped for battle, Sunday school an attacking squad, Christian radio the artillery. Like slaves and soldiers, Christians were to follow orders and ask no questions. The holy war Falwell was fighting was a political war, a war to resist feminism, communism, abortion, government intervention in the family, in segregated Christian schools, and also rampant homosexuality, in his words. It was a war between those who loved Jesus and hated him. At Thomas Road Baptist, outsiders were depicted as enemies, or at least potential enemies, but Falwell promised protection. In this way, Falwell's authority depended on maintaining a sense of vulnerability among his followers, which he accomplished through the continual fabrication of new enemies. His own power depended on it. Falwell's militancy was linked to masculinity. It was men, not women, who were to lead the church and nation in battle. Falwell's savior, too, reflected this militant masculinity. He couldn't stomach effeminate depictions of Christ as a delicate man with long hair and flowing robes. Jesus was a man with muscles. Christ was a he-man. Now, during the 1990s, evangelical militancy appeared to ebb for a time. The Cold War had come to an end, and with it, the existential threat to Christian America that had long mobilized evangelicals, causing many evangelicals to rethink their commitment to a militant masculinity that had come to seem outdated, even retrograde. In response to these confusing times, the Evangelical Promise Keepers movement offered confusing answers. Theirs was a kinder, gentler masculinity, a masculinity that affirmed men's emotions while still maintaining patriarchal authority. It was a soft patriarchy. By the end of the decade, however, a backlash had begun against an overemphasis on softness, on tenderness. And by 2001, a return to militancy was in full swing. The resurgence of this is represented in John Eldredge's runaway bestseller, Wild at Heart. Eldredge championed a testosterone-fueled masculinity that was thoroughly militaristic. God made men to be dangerous, he explained, but the strength that made men dangerous also made them heroes. But church and society offered confusing messages, redefining masculinity into something sensitive, safe, feminine, contributing to this crisis in masculinity. The antidote was to foster a warrior culture, a place where men could learn to fight like men. Cowboys, soldiers, and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart offered models of a wild Christian manhood. That this Christian manhood, militant Christian manhood, contradicted traditional Christian teachings mattered little. Gone was talk of patience, kindness, gentleness, or self-control. Men were protectors and defenders, and an aggressive offense made the best defense. Most importantly, because man was made in the image of a warrior God, every man needed a battle to fight. Militancy required enemies, actual or imagined. Just months after Eldredge's Wild at Heart appeared on the shelves of Christian bookstores, terrorists struck the United States. Suddenly, Christian men again had a real, not merely rhetorical battle to fight. In the early 2000s, white evangelicals were enthusiastic proponents of the war on terror. In 2002, they also became leading proponents of the Iraq War. Even as other Christians urged the president to refrain from a preemptive strike, evangelical leaders sent the president a letter assuring him that preemptive invasion of Iraq did indeed meet the criteria for just war and use of force. Ordinary evangelicals were the biggest backers of the war. 69% of conservative Christians favored military action. In 2003, once the war commenced, 87% of white evangelical Christians supported his decision to go to war, compared to 59% of secular Americans. Evangelicals defended this militancy in terms of the threat radical Islam posed to America and to American Christians. Yet a closer examination of the Islamophobia that ran rampant through conservative evangelicalism in the 2000s complicates this narrative, suggesting instead the primacy of militancy over fear. And nowhere is this clearer than in the curious proliferation of fraudulent ex-Muslim terrorists who took the evangelical speaking circuit by storm in the years after 9/11. The most prominent of these were Ergen and Amir Khanner, two brothers whose 2002 book, Unveiling Islam, became a bestseller in evangelical circles. It was based on purported firsthand experience, and it detailed the dangerous and violent nature of Islam. But critics quickly pointed to half-truths and mischaracterizations that cluttered the book. Still, they were promoted by prominent evangelicals such as Paige Patterson, Jerry Vines, and Jerry Falwell. And in fact, Ergen Connor was hired to teach at Liberty University's School of Religion. These are only two of many of these ex-Muslim terrorists who were promoted by evangelical leaders, including James Dobson and his focus on the family, even though all of them were revealed to be frauds, and conservative evangelicals continued to promote them long after they had been revealed as frauds. The popularity of these ex-Muslim terrorists casts in stark relief the dynamics of an evangelical politics of fear. Trafficking in a pornography of violence, these experts shared graphic but false stories demonstrating the sadistic violence of Islam, thereby dehumanizing Muslims while goading Americans, and especially American Christians, to respond with violence of their own. With titles like "Why We Want to Kill You," they positioned American Christians as victims and justified a violent response. The fact that conservative evangelicals continued to promote them suggests that that fear wasn't primary here, but that militancy required the cultivation of fear. Another vivid example of this relationship between fear and power is seen in Mark Driscoll's church in the 2000s, very similar to Jerry Falwell Sr.'s, and very linked up in this Islamophobia and American militarism as well. I don't have time to cover that right now. But Driscoll's teachings did go on to inspire a generation of young evangelical men in the 2000s who were drawn to this aggressive masculinity and militant Christianity that he both preached and performed. So by the time Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president, the pattern was deeply entrenched. After 8 years of enduring the Obama presidency, evangelical rhetoric of fear was at a fevered pitch, particularly in light of Hillary Clinton's nomination. In the words of Reverend Robert Jeffress, "I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what, and I think that's where many evangelicals are." In the words of Trump's evangelical biographers, he was their ultimate fighting champion. Evangelical fear is real, but too often it is manufactured by evangelical organizations and leaders to consolidate their own religious and political power. Men like Falwell and Driscoll ratcheted up a sense of threat in order to enhance their own power. And we see the same thing in the case of the ex-Muslim terrorists. This calculation only works in a militarized context, when those who feel threatened are conditioned to look to a militant protector. And for decades, conservative evangelicals have been groomed to do just that. So in conclusion, in the case of the coronavirus, we see evidence that this militant masculinity is functioning and as part of this larger ideology. I'll skip over some evidence that we have, survey evidence here, and jump to the very language that these pastors are using, many of whom are resisting efforts to contain the virus. The Tampa Bay pastor, Rodney Howard Brown, that I
tradução. Parou a tradução.
Está mutado, Denise. Denise parou para beber uma água. Denise está no muto. Ah, tá.
Are we having trouble?
Sorry, Kristin. Juliana. Entrou. Sim. Kristin, please come back 1 minute because the translation changed and you have problem in the translation. Small time.
Okay, so go back a little.
Tá funcionando. One word, one phrase, one paragraph, no more.
Okay, sure. So we hear language, this militant rhetoric in the language that evangelical pastors are using to resist the efforts to contain the virus. So the pastor that I started off with, Pastor Rodney Brown, reminded his flock that they weren't a bunch of pansies, and that's why they should keep worshiping. His friend, televangelist Jonathan Shuttlesworth, similarly denigrated loser pastors who canceled services and suggested that the use of hand sanitizer betrayed a lack of manliness. Quote, if you're putting out pamphlets and telling everybody to use Purell before they come into the sanctuary, you're a loser. Bunch of pansies, no balls, got neutered somewhere along the line and don't even realize it, end quote. In my own hometown of Grand Rapids, an evangelical pastor just down the road urged Christians to, quote, grow a pair, to act like men, to be strong. What was needed was a masculine toughness within the body of Christ that would prevent the church from following the herd, from following government health mandates. In his own handling of the virus, President Trump reinforces this framing. When the virus struck, he declared himself a wartime president and called on Americans to think of themselves as warriors, but not tasked with beating the virus, rather with reopening the economy. Now, even in the face of a deadly virus, it is not primarily fear, but militancy that motivates evangelicals to defy government stay-at-home orders, resist wearing masks in public spaces, to view the media with suspicion, to interpret public health recommendations as an affront to their religious rights, and to frame the crisis in familiar us versus them culture wars terms. This response should come as no surprise. History demonstrates that evangelical militancy, not fear, must be understood as a primary driver of evangelical politics. Only if we center militancy rather than fear and protection does this coronavirus response make sense, as does the last half century of evangelical politics. At the heart of this is the myth of the masculine protector, which was always more about militancy than protection. Because for all their talk of protecting the vulnerable, by which they only ever meant their own women and children, and of those, only those deemed worthy of protection by virtue of their proper submission to masculine authority, concern for health and safety are not motivating conservative evangelicals during the pandemic. Rather, concern for the authority of their own pastors and churches to defy government mandates characterizes their response. The rhetoric of religious liberty accompanies resistance to church closures, but state-mandated closures to in-person worship are a direct assault on evangelical masculine power, the authority of its masculine leaders. This militancy has always required an enemy to fight, and here the enemy is not an obvious one, the deadly virus. Instead, evangelicals have fallen into familiar patterns in identifying the other as their enemy: China, liberals, Democrats, the mainstream media, or those with medical and scientific expertise. Of course, the problem is that in responding in this way, Trump's evangelical warriors will only be playing into the hands of the invisible enemy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Vamos então passar a palavra para a professora Heidi.
So we're now going to open for questions for Professor Heidi Hadsell. She was former president of Hartford Seminary, a PhD in University of Southern California. She was in Brazil for a while and she acts in social ethics. She also was part of the World Council of Churches and Christian perspectives on interreligious and reflections on empathy. She was with us in Nagel Institute in 2013, and she is very captivating, and it'll be a great pleasure to have her. Professor Heidi, thank you for being with us tonight, this evening. We turn over to you. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you and the people I hadn't seen in many years. So I'm going to speak English.
Tradutora está pronta? Muito obrigada. It looks to me, I'm going to step back for a minute in this discussion. It looks to me like many important evangelical leaders in the United States and Brazil have made a bargain with the devil. They've given up their souls for secular power and personal profit. and also for protection of evangelical beliefs, institutions, and issues. Or as Joel put it a bit more gently yesterday than I put it, these leaders have been co-opted by the system and its corruptions. The movement from a strong, sometimes strong, critique of Trump by many evangelical leaders early in his presidential campaign to the full-blown embrace of him some months later is a movement that is well documented and described. And the Brazilians, I'd love to hear a similar kind of description in Brazil of that process with Bolsonaro. The two papers in this session this afternoon describe very well the two essential parts of this bargain. First comes the bargain itself, and then comes the justification of the bargain to the people who follow these leaders. The justification being the various elements and ramifications of the politics of fear, which play on and exaggerate already existing fears. The politics of fear is essential in making this bargain with the devil succeed. As so well described by our speakers, the politics of fear, white evangelical and Christian nationalism, or Brazilian evangelical fundamentalism, in the words of Ronilso, is a politics purposely designed to keep one set of people together in the fold, afraid of others, other ethnicities, other religions, other sexualities, and so forth, afraid of change, sure of themselves and their own beliefs, reliably voting for the candidates their leaders support, and unable or unwilling to build or join larger movements for change, for economic or racial justice, for example, and especially unwilling to think outside the box. Many of the core values represented in this politics of fear, either overtly or in coded language, are, as we are all aware, antithetical to Christianity. Indeed, Scripture admonishes us not to indulge in fear. Scripture also warns us against hypocrisy, the hypocrisy so evident when Christians, ignoring Jesus's teachings about the love of other and responsibility to and service to the other, indulge in their own desires for excessive material gain and power. The Gospels also teach us to know and to follow the truth. Sadly, COVID-19 has become for many a way to defy the truth of science. Kristin calls our attention to the very foolish politics of fearlessness, faith over fear, on the part of many evangelicals who refuse to take precautions against COVID-19 and thereby put others in danger as well as themselves. The power gained by evangelicals, or rather evangelical leaders in this bargain with the devil, in part, as Ronilso points out, is the protection by politicians and their laws of the theology and ideology of fundamentalist evangelicalism. That was your phrase, Ronilso. Yes. Otherwise, the power gained, at least as far as I can tell, is not used in ways we could reasonably expect from Christian leaders. It is not used to serve the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized. It is not used to call the powerful into question. It is not used to protect our natural environment. In fact, it seems like it does not really even serve the interests of the base of evangelicals well at all. Perhaps evangelicals feel more powerful and more visible with their leaders so close to and supportive of political power, and indeed some of them enjoying the seat of power themselves, like Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. But on the other hand, so many people, evangelicals in the evangelical movement, are left fearful and suspicious, afraid of others, nostalgic for a time in society that never really existed, without the conceptual or emotional tools to participate in or embrace the very diverse and changing societies around them. Nor does the power gained by the leaders serve the constructive role of helping the seeds of an alternative vision of society grow, one that is more kind, more just, more inclusive, more democratic. What a sad and terrible waste of power and opportunity this is. At this point, with democratic institutions collapsing under the pressure of Trump and his enablers, including evangelicals, and with coronavirus killing hundreds of thousands among us, Brazilians and Americans and many others, while it is ignored or defied by our leaders, some of our fellow citizens, one fervently hopes, by our leaders and some of our fellow citizens, one fervently hopes for a collapse of this bargain with the devil. One hopes for an end to the fear that Kristin describes. One hopes for a coming to one's senses at all levels and corners of society. Black lives matter. In the US anyway, I don't think there is a way back. One can always only go forward. This has been a time of COVID, but it's also been a time of widespread awakening or reawakening to the injustices, racial, economic, sexist, that run throughout the society and that are reflected in the patterns of death and sickness of the virus. Going forward, we, the rest of the society, need the evangelicals among us. Not just because you, they are many, the majority religion in the United States. We need evangelicals to work together with us, to be a part of us, joining others and being guided by and sharing the commitments to the values and vision of the gospel. The politics of fear and the bargain with the devil for power, evangelical power, are obstacles that are in the way. Michael Gerson, a columnist for the Washington Post, who is an evangelical, had an article recently in which he reflected on the Black Lives Matter movement. He said, and I quote, "But sometimes people can only move forward when they have their past returned to them. Evangelicals and others seeking guidance on dealing with racial matters have much to learn from Wesley, his passion for human dignity, his embrace of empathy, his willingness to follow the demands of justice beyond his ideological comfort zone. Even as a conservative, Wesley demonstrated that the sincere, consistent commitment to human dignity is more radical than most imagine." The concept of human dignity, its meaning and its depth, is a concept that belongs to all of us. It is something that non-evangelical Christians, evangelicals, non-religious people, people of other faiths can know and view as precious. It is perhaps one way one essential insight and value around which we can move forward together. Thank you.
Obrigado, Heidi. Obrigado cada a cada
Thank you so much, Heidi, and each one of the speakers. And now, without further ado, we're going to move on to the questions, Q&A session. I'm going to start by Ronilso. I'm going to ask Ronilso 3 questions, and then 3 to Kristin. And then if you'd like to comment anything about the reactions by Dr. Heidi, you can also feel free. And then I'm going to comment on other questions. As I have this power as the chair of this session, I will comment on the questions, and I'll take it upon myself to do that. So in relation to Ronilso, and there's also a question that I'll place to Heidi and Kristin. So let's do it. Ronilso, first question to you. It's commonly affirmed that Candomblé and Ubanda, among others, are religions practiced majoritarily by Black people. However, these religions today are universal in the sense that there have been many conversions and many of them are white. On the other hand, Pentecostals are in their majority Black, and Neo-Pentecostals are the ones who commit violence against Afro-Brazilians. So how can we deal with this racial problem of violence? This was a question by Geraldo Jr. Shirley, Executive Director of the International Network of Education for Higher Education, and I'm also part of that same organization. Thank you so much for your presence, Shirley. To Renee, so she asks, do you feel that the narrative about the propagation of communism through the virus, like Kung Flu instead of Kung Fu is a play on words, is different in the United States compared to Brazil? We observe that in the United States, the Chinese are pointed at as a nation to blame for the virus, but not the fear of the Chinese being communist. So it seems like the rhetoric about the fear of communism is more present in Brazil than in the United States. At last, Daisy asks a question to Renilso. Here in Brazil, does it make sense, the expression white evangelicals? Does that make sense here in Brazil, this expression? We know that racism exists in the Brazilian church, but it has other characteristics, right? The organization Ambassadors of the King in the Baptist churches brings this message, strong message. So Ronilso, in 5 or 10 minutes, maybe can talk about it.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm going to stick to the time. So first, about Candomblé and Neo-Pentecostals, Candomblé, even though it is a universalized religion, it is also a religion that comes from African traditions, and that doesn't change. And that helps answer the second question about racism, because racism is overall in theology. So the fact that you have more Blacks in the church, in a certain denomination or a segment, and we are talking about Neo-Pentecostals here, doesn't make a lot of difference in this sense, because racism, more than religiosity, is present in theology, and that is shown, it shows the depth and the severe problem we have in Brazil, because it makes the Black identity not to be recognized, and two Black people cannot dialogue from their history, their past, and music that probably should mark their lives overall in the peripheral areas. And this is extremely racist. So if we think of the origin, known origin of Pentecostalism, the rupture between apostolic mission of the faith and the Assemblies of God, and the Assemblies of God are a white sector, and it is the there is a black segment, especially from Rua Azus, and that captures the racial issue. And as a quick answer, we should think less of religion and more on theology, because it is theology that gives the perspective that necessarily the African continent is a cursed continent marked by witchcraft, by evil, by demons, and so forth and so on. And so this is present, including when a person moves from this religion to Pentecostals, is they have this sense that they have been set free, that set free from this tradition, this spirituality and this worldview, so to speak. So we can see racism in theology in that regard. About the rhetoric of communism, without a shadow of a doubt, Brazil in Brazil it is stronger, but recently mass resistance has attacked Black Lives Matter. It has backlashed it 2 months ago to now. And one of the items and the accusations, and this is for us to see it is present, as if Black Lives Matter wanted to destroy the family and the churches, and as if it were a communist and Marxist movement. From the racial agenda coming up to these other agendas. And Capital Ministry, this group connected to the White House and ministers studies to politicians, parliamentary members, and other places in the world, especially Latin America, as communism is one of their main studies, main Bible studies for politicians and conservative parliamentary members. Capitalism and communism are in the agenda, as capitalism is a system chosen by God and communism isn't. And maybe they don't use the rhetoric of communism and more so towards the Chinese as to blame for the virus, but in the evangelical segment, it is implicit in the image of the Chinese, the association to communism and the Christian institution. And at last, in relation to evangelical Haiti, it makes all the sense in the world. You can only see that when you leave the church. I wouldn't use it as a category unless you use it in the sense of theology and the concept of a racism, to think of the white church not as a church composed by white people, but as a church that is within this theology that is extremely racist and whitened. So, but in general, I avoid using some of these terms because of the complexities that they bring. So I prefer to continue in the religious racism term and in evangelical fundamentalism, and less in the perspective of white evangelicals, because it serves some places, but the structure doesn't amount to our racial conflicts. It's more complex than that. So you were good on time, very succinct, very direct. So your time in the United States is doing you good. Exactly, everything is very marked in time. So we turn over to Kristin now. And I have another question for you later. So Kristin, Shirley's question as well. I would think that the evangelicals that seek a protector, an active protector, would like a consistent protector, a more consistent protector, so something more substantial. But Trump has been highly inconsistent, both in his rhetoric and his politics about the virus. What leads people to remain with an inconsistent protector if they look for consistency? Do they dismiss inconsistency? Interesting question. So Brenda is asking Kristin also, how do the faithful see this denialism of the pandemic by the leadership when the victims of COVID are around them, their family members and friends, when these deaths are so close to them and the consequences? And then I move on also to, so that Kristin can talk about her book. Someone say that if she can talk, if you can talk more about your book, Kristin, as well, at last. So, Kristin, Eric asked me to tell you, whenever you're speaking, if you can turn off the interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've been doing that. I hope so, each time. So let's see, to the questions, Shirley, a consistent protector. Why aren't they asking for one with respect to the virus? And this is actually connected to Brenda's question in some ways too. One thing is, again, this kind of militancy that they embrace, consistency and a kind of measured dependability isn't high up on the list of attributes that they cherish in a strong protector. And if you look at the language that they use, they talk a lot about testosterone, that God filled men with testosterone so that they can have the aggression that they need to defend family and God and country. And that creates a kind of recklessness. And that's just one of the side effects of testosterone. And so you need that recklessness, and it's not always ideal, but you can forgive these flaws because that's the kind of man that you need. Now that's part of it. That's kind of like the masculinity angle. But then there's also the fact that, and this picks up with Brenda's question, you know, how are they continuing in this when people around them are dying? And here I would bring out the racial statistics that Ronilso mentioned, because many more people of color are dying than white Americans. And so it's not hitting many white evangelical communities as hard. It also started in predominantly liberal areas, the West Coast, the East Coast. Now it's moving more towards kind of red state America. But I'm in touch with many evangelicals who live in those areas. And there is, you need to understand too that they, many conservative evangelicals consume an entirely separate media. So their sources of news are very, very different. And so their understanding of this pandemic, the seriousness of it, people I know are questioning the death counts. They are questioning the deadliness of this virus. A lot of skepticism out there. So in some ways, we're really operating with two very separate realities. And this too is very consistent within conservative white evangelicalism for the past 75 years, distrusting kind of secular sources, the mainstream media. There's a long history to that, and this kind of us versus them mentality. And so you only trust your sources. And right now their sources are Fox News, their own pastors, and President Trump, frankly. And so they are getting a very different message about the severity of the virus and what should be done to combat it. And it is striking how deeply this shapes their understanding of this reality, and any global comparison doesn't really get through in my experience. Okay, so then my book, I'm supposed to talk about my book too. So Eric said I need to hold it up. So here's the book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. This book released about 7 weeks ago, and the response thus far has been really quite remarkable. Astonishing is the word that my publisher is using. They had no idea that I tried to tell them that Christians would be interested in this book too, and they weren't so sure about that. And in fact, I've received, I think now, more than 150 letters from evangelicals or former evangelicals responding to this book, tracing their own lives through the story that I tell. And so much gratitude. And also what has been really striking is how so many people weren't able to see the big picture through their own personal encounters with this ideology, with this faith. and also how much fear there still is. There are many people who are reaching out to me who don't dare to go public with the fact that they've read this book. There are organizations asking me to speak, but none of their organizers can appear on camera with me because they will lose their jobs. And it's really interesting. I'm sensing a real unrest within even conservative evangelical communities, but the balance of power is still such that it forces a lot of silence, complicit silence. And, you know, this is such a critical moment in the next few months in the United States in particular, with the election looming, with the coronavirus continuing to rage. And so I think it's a very interesting moment, and it's remarkable to see how the book is being received.
It's sold out in Grand Rapids. You can't find it.
Okay, thank you, Kristin.
Thank you, Kristin. So now I'm going to pose a question that came through the chat to Ronilso. And Brenda asked, do you think that domination theology transcoded to Brazil actualized the imaginary of a slave worldview? What indicators would you say there are in the peripheral areas of the big cities? So the second part of the question, just to make sure I understood, these identifiers, these signals of these domination authorities. So as I am the speaker, I can say whatever I want. Just kidding. So I think concerning the domination theology, I think it's important for us to think of that, because this idea, it seems to be rethought, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind it's not a current, it's a continuation of something that was before. In our evangelical world, a big part of our missionaries, and João Chaves' book shows that about the Baptists and the racial issue, but we can think of Presbyterians, we can think of a significant part of Methodists, and we can think of big part of the evangelical world in this country is slavist and based on domination theology, in big part because Brazil doesn't have the experience of Black churches, because they are very recent. We have in the United States, they have been there for many centuries, but they don't have a transcontinental missionary work to build new territories overseas, and they are so worried about the racial dimension in the United States, and this doesn't give them time to do missionary work. And they are also concerned about other matters. And so the people who expanded the evangelical world are slavists. They have the perspective of domination and control. These were the missionaries, and this is important for us to think about. And there was a question by Gideon about putting things in the places where they belong. And we can think about not only how it affects and is reproduced and replicated from the grassroots, from the peripheral areas, but also how it is deliberately construed in an illustrated universe. And it's important to highlight that there are people who were not, they were racist because they were evangelicals, in such a way that maybe they wouldn't be so racist if they had not been part of a particular church at that point in time and that theology. So there's a part that is not affected by theologies, but they are were part of this moment of slavery. And in relation to the peripheral areas, in the same way, maybe the other way around, in the peripheral areas, we could find alternatives to of subversion and how to subvert this context that is extremely controlling and oppressive. And in the most illustrated about the bargain with the devil, they are doing it consciously. They are aware and they don't feel guilty. They don't feel repentant over it. It is a choice, a deliberate choice. And so I would say that the Dominion theology is our theology. It was part of the way we were shaped, and I would look at it as a way to look for alternatives of surprising things in peripheral areas, despite great part of thinkers that showed, as an illustration, all of their science. They show opposition, they show denial of science in affirming this delusional denialism that is a deliberate choice and illiterate as well.
Obrigado, Ronilso. Eu tenho uma pergunta que eu vou fazer para os três, duas perguntas.
So there are three questions I'm going to make. So I'm going to make a comment about Odimar for our North American friends who live in the North. Yesterday here in Brazil was published a research study that the highlights of the newspaper showed that Bolsonaro would be recovering his popularity now. So someone commented that 47% of Brazilians considered that Bolsonaro is not to blame or is not responsible for the number of deaths. In the first comment, 53% considers that it is. So a half empty or a half full cup, depending on the perspective. So the number of deaths of COVID is much greater than the world, a particular world of Bolsonaro, his governors, and what the economy represents. So maybe if we can think of the blame, if we can think about is a lack of governance and leadership as an option, a political option he made by having this behavior during the pandemic. And so the point that I would like to highlight here, because Daisy also mentioned, is first of all, this moment we're going through as countries, Brazil, United States, and the whole world is very severe moment. It's very complex, the tension between economy and health. In the Brazilian situation, we have the unified health system as US, and it's important to have this space to fight against the pandemic, and especially the lack of coordination, governance, and we have the pressure of economic groups to reopen businesses and stores on Valentine's Day, for instance. So about Bolsonaro's growth in popularity, it's important to put it into perspective. Trump's election upcoming election or not in the future in the United States is central. In our discussion here in Brazil, it's very important for our situation in Brazil and what's going to happen in the United States will affect us. And on the other hand, it's also important to remember and highlight that Bolsonaro is a legitimate leadership, was elected supposedly legitimate in the electoral process. And it's a political social issue, of course, it's a fact. But what we have to consider is that in the first administration of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, he had almost 64% of approval. President Lula as well. Dilma Rousseff had 70%. So the last presidents that had their term in the beginning and completed 18 months, they had percentages that were twice as much of what Bolsonaro has right now. So we need to keep that in perspective. Every president in the beginning of their term seems to usually have a high percentage. It's absurd to think that this percentage can approve. But the Folha de São Paulo feature was a bit complicated if we analyze from other perspectives. And so there is a care because we have a political game at play. He is trying to get closer to the center. Politically, we call it the big center is between right and left. And we have changes in the profile of people who support it. There's a parcel of the poorer evangelicals, and we have the movements of change going on there alongside a complexity that is much broader. So I'm going to go back with two questions that I'm going to follow both to Heidi and to Kristin and to Ronilso.
So Gideon's first question that Ronilso already commented on, he says it's in theory it's easy to see this denial of science in the peripheral populations and the ideas of Brazilian Pentecostalism with time. But how can we understand currently this same stance of non-Pentecostal leaders, even some of them with PhDs and with years in the academia, that are still supporting this government? And so I would like to use this question and to ask this about this saving man, this protector man of the white woman and of whites. This is interesting, but about 15 years ago, Djanira promoted a course with Molly, and Molly has a book on the apostles of reason, and she commented on the importance of neo-Calvinism and all this discussion on the Kuyperian worldview and how this was used by some of the segments of the United States, and of how this denialism is something that fits with this discussion and this what we're seeing. And so how can we make up for this presence of denialism, because it seems to be a perfect match, right? Denialism on the one hand, fundamented on a neo-Calvinist Kuyperian discussion in what is happening within fundamentalism and the white evangelicals. The other question that I would like to hear from your opinion on is what Vanessa asked, and this is what she stated. The central axis when we're discussing gender roles in a society is to show the gender inequality. And historically and culturally speaking, gender inequalities are not neutral. In different societies, genders are construed as social stratification, and we many times see this supposed superiority of males over females. Unfortunately, in Brazilian history, women have been considered subordinate to men, and it is sad that a minister, as we have here in Brazil, that is the minister of the Ministry of Women, Children, and Human Rights, she has a public policy in which we see this man-centrism as a main fundamental matter. And the point that I would like to make, and I would like to hear from Kristin, Heidi, and Ronilso, is this minister, Damaris. She is our minister in this ministry that I mentioned, and Ronilso mentioned in his talk a ministerial meeting that had a recording that was leaked to the media, and Damaris, this minister, was the only woman among 30 other men. So there were 2 women actually and 20, 30 men, and Damaris was being treated harshly. The minister of the economy, who's a super minister here in Brazil, he's very aggressive towards her in the meeting. And you know, trying to summarize and make all of these connections, the idea is, how can we think these women that are suffering as women in these situations in which these protective men are there, and they end up reproducing these public policies that reinstate this masculinity. And a sentence that Vanessa said, you know, boys should wear blue and girls should wear pink. And so she ends up reproducing, repeating all these, all this mindset. I think I spoke too much, I'm sorry. But so Heidi can start. Okay, Heidi? Heidi, a comment?
Just a question really wonderful for Ronilso and one for Kristin. So I'm just going to let them answer, and if I have something to add, I will.
Obrigado, Heidi. Então, Ronilso, depois Kristin.
So first Ronilso and then Kristin. Bem, regarding those who are more literate, and you called the attention to the neo-Calvinists. Well, summarizing, I would say that denialism, it's interesting to consider that the neo-Calvinists here in Brazil, they are connected to scientific thinking, scientific matters, but there is a greater goal here we see. How can you preserve worldview? So as denialism, if denialism does not hamper this worldview, this cultural war, and it does not harm this space and this struggle, because that's the place that they want to be in. Culture, education is important, foreign affairs is important, justice is important, human rights is important. So in the same way that this worldview is not impaired by denialism and everything that it entails, this interest ends up having a higher voice. It's still a pact, as Heidi said, of this bargaining with the devil. What is written in the agreement in this bargaining process? This is not something subtle. This is not just a consequence of something else, or this is not a betrayal. This is a deliberate choice. This is part of a project, and it's established as a project, and this worldview is part of this spectrum of Christian worldview. So when this possibility of dominion and of victory is not hampered, denialism does not, actually denialism can be relativized. And I believe that this is what they're after, this place that they want to occupy. And we see that in Brazil, these spaces are being subtly won and taken over, even though the government continues to perpetrate a lot of violence. As long as these spaces are being taken up, it's great. Thank you very much. Kristin, you have the floor.
Okay, so I'll speak just a little bit too to the neo-Calvinism and role of presuppositionalism in the conservative evangelical worldview. And I say that as a Calvinist myself and somebody who is trained in kind of presuppositional thinking. So not all of us are necessarily in this camp, but if you look at historically through figures like Francis Schaeffer and even like Bill Gothard and others who are kind of critical to this intellectual formation, you do see the role that a kind of Calvinist presuppositionalism plays, and then it kind of morphs into you know, an us versus them, and we on the inside have truth and access to truth because we have God's truth, and you can't trust anybody else. And in this conservative evangelical space, this was also very tightly linked to hierarchical structuring of society in a patriarchal way. And so patriarchal gender roles and a very authoritarian understanding of how society ought to function went hand in hand with this presuppositional thinking as well. And that you can see in the 1960s and 70s, kind of the origins, or it's hard to say origin as a historian, but you can see at this critical moment. And then again, in the kind of new popularity of New Calvinism in the 1990s and 2000s, you see these same patterns kind of repeated. So what do women get from this? And you're absolutely right that conservative women reproduce this ideology. Some women are very happy with it. Some women find their purpose and identity in a subservient role. It's also important to note that not all men who might adhere to this ideology practice it in a very harsh way in the home. There's a lot of variation there. But many women find, again, their identity, but many women also simply believe that this is God's will for them. And that has been inculcated in them since birth. And so there's a combination of factors happening. I will also say that there are many women who have thought this was God's will for them, who are suffering greatly. The last chapter of my book is about sexual abuse scandals within evangelical communities. And some prominent women really have rejected this ideology because of violence towards women in particular. And Beth Moore would be the most famous example, but there are many others. And so there's a variety of responses within white evangelicalism, but many women do prop up this ideology. Some say enough is enough. And so that's something that that I continue to watch and see how that unfolds in the coming months as well.
Thank you. Obrigado, Kristin.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Dr. Dumais, thank you, every one of you who are here tonight. So I was reading the chat when I heard you speak, and I just want to comment on two things. Well, the issue that Claudemir was talking about, the Federal Supreme Court in Brazil, and I agree with you, Claudemir, in a way, because I think it is very easy to just blame Bolsonaro regarding the pandemic. Yes, I agree with you that the main fault actually lies in a lack of leadership. As someone said, there's this absence of world leaders that are actually facing the pandemic well. And the other aspect is the ministers of health that were removed from office because they were opposing the position that the president had. But the main thing for me is the blame of mayors and governors, you know, if you want to blame anyone. And I work at the Center of the Socials of Sciences of Health of the Federal University of Rio. And since January, we were desperate in terms of what could happen when the pandemic reached Brazil. And we wanted to, you know, create room for testing, increase the number of beds, trying to consider how people were going to handle this socially. So we were very calm about how things would come to be. And we thought that there would be a lot of economic costs related to that. But human lives cannot be measured by the economy. So you can't use this argument that the economy dying would kill more people than the people that are dying, et cetera. So I recommend that you would talk to some lawyers about this, but there was something even more complex because the government went to the Federal Supreme Court and they wanted them to intervene. And it seems, in my interpretation, that this was an argument that Bolsonaro wanted to have so that the responsibility would not be his. But if it's something from the federal government, it needed leadership, and that was lacking. And I know that there are many things that we're discussing here that only pertain to Brazil, and I'm sorry for those of you who are not from our country, but of course we need to analyze a lot. This is only one poll, and it's a recent poll, but it's a very easy response related to Bolsonaro's popularity. And, you know, if it's only that, that's fine. So I think that's it. We need to take a picture now, turn on your lights and turn on your cameras. And I'm not sure if Hannah is still here. If Hannah is here, I want her to take this picture. So tonight, we are starting the closing session at 9 p.m. and I would really ask you to be punctual. We are going to start with a musical presentation. Cássia Raquel is a Brazilian singer, beautiful singer, and she is phenomenal. And we're going to have a 30-minute set list that was curated by Eric, and we know that it will be of great taste, and I'm sure all of you will love it. So 8 to 10 Brazilian and American songs that will be sung by this singer. So it's something that you really can't miss. So please
Gente, eu tô
smile
vendo que
now.
tem muita
And
gente ainda
let
com
me
as
see.
janelinhas
I think there are
fechadas.
many people that are
Eu vou
still
pedir
not on
novamente,
camera.
porque
So I
realmente
would
fica
like to
bem
ask
bacana
you
se
to
todos
start
estiverem
your
com a
video.
janelinha
So if
aberta.
all of you
O
have your
último slide
videos
praticamente está todo mundo com a
started
janela
right
fechada.
now, it will be great.
Antônio
So
Gabriel,
please,
Washington,
Antonio Gabriel,
Brenda,
Washington,
William,
Brenda, William,
Matias, Aldo,
Matias,
Hamilton.
Alto,
Por favor, vamos
Hamilton,
abrindo
all of
a
you,
janelinha
please
para a gente poder
start your
fazer essa
videos
foto. É
so that we
pedido
can
que
take
a gente faz. A
this
Daisy
picture.
também precisa abrir.
Daisy as well,
Você que está
please
com
start
dificuldade,
your
a gente pode
video
tentar ajudar.
and we can help you if you have any questions on how you should start your video. So it's 7 p.m. now, and we will be back at 9 p.m. here in Brazil, 8 p.m. in the US for the East Coast. And we will hear Cássia Raquel's presentation, and then we're going to have Retief Muller's speech and Henrique Alonso, our guru and our reference about everything in the world. If you have any questions, you can just talk to Henrique and he will guide you. So
Já
in the
tirou a
evening
foto,
session,
Alexandre?
have you taken the picture?
Ai,
She's taking the picture.
é que
Okay.
era legal o pessoal tipo marcar para
It would
poder
be
olhar para
great for
frente.
people to just look up. So let us take the picture now formally. Stop and smile, please. 1, 2, 3.
Espero que deve ter ido já.
I think.
Tá bom, então.
I think
Obrigada,
it worked,
gente.
right? Thank you very much. So we will be back at 9, and after we hear all the comments, we are going to open the microphone. We're going to have about 40 minutes available for that, so you can go back and you can maybe even post a comment on camera. Marion commented about a blog, and this afternoon I was talking to Eric, and we are going to invite everyone who participated from the Nagel Institute, but we want to create a website, a blog or something so that we can share our texts, share ideas, and many models that are seen here that we know people are gathering to publish and post podcasts and texts. So we want to have this common space on social media where we can exchange ideas that will be recorded and also in writing. So this is something that we will look forward to in the next days. Thank you very much, Dr. Dumais. Thank you, Dr. Hadsell. Thank you, Ronilso. And thank you, Juliana and Denise, and all of you that are present with us here today. Thank you very much. Let's go to dinner. Rest well and see you soon. Good evening. See you.